Well, extremely disturbing images have been coming out of Gaza of men stripped nearly naked, hands bound, who are being detained by the IDF. Look at these images here. These men, these images are coming out now. Israel is saying that these were Hamas. Their claim initially was that these men crawled out of a tunnel, that they were then arrested by the IDF, obviously stripped naked to make sure that they didn't have any weapons on them, and that it's a big win for Israel. This is what they were initially saying. What was interesting about this, though, is that the reports, even from Times of Israel, actually didn't say that these were Hamas fighters. And Times of Israel is a very right-wing news organization, pro-Israel news organization, and they were even saying these were Gaza men. They weren't saying Hamas fighters. I want you to look at this image right here. Go back to the other image. This image right here. Now, the claim was that these were Hamas fighters, but look at those sandals on the ground. I mean, these are the men's shoes. And those do not look like the shoes of fighters. These are sandals. It's actually a very disturbing image. I don't know how any person who's seen images of the Holocaust can look at this and not see some equivalencies here with shoes, and people being rounded up. And I mean, it's just, these are very similar images that and it was a very similar excuse. I mean, back during the Nazi times, they were saying, well, they're criminals. We have to, they're committing crimes. They can't assimilate. They're different than us. We have to preserve our culture. We have to preserve, and then they were doing very similar things. So you've got all these men being rounded up. Now here's the Times of Israel article. These images are just terrible. These men being, many of them are older. You've got, but they're all what the IDF claimed of fighting age. So they originally said these are Hamas fighters. They crawled out of a tunnel. We arrested them. See, look at our victory. Probably because they've been raked through the coals lately over their extraordinarily high death rate of civilians to combatants. They've not, they keep fudging the numbers to try to make it sound better than it actually is. But they originally said we've killed about 1,000 Hamas fighters. And that was when the reports were they'd killed 15 to 20,000 civilians. So that's not a very high ratio of civilian. There are a lot of civilians, many of them children and women, most of them. And so then they started fudging the numbers and saying, well, no, actually, we've killed 5,000 Hamas fighters, which would have been all the men. So they're claiming that every man they killed in Gaza happened to be a Hamas fighter. And then they release these images and these videos here where they say, well, look, we found all these Hamas fighters. Look at these people. And yet there are no guns in these photographs. We don't see any weapons at all. And they're wearing sandals. And on top of that, some of these men have been recognized as journalists. But look at this Times of Israel sheet. So Times of Israel says Gaza men, exposing the fact that these are not. So they say footage shows dozens of Gaza men, so not Hamas, said to have surrendered to IDF, reportedly may be Hamas suspects. So they start off, Times of Israel is even kind of skeptical of the IDF's claim. So they say, these are Gaza men, maybe Hamas, right? So that's the first clue that there's not really any evidence that these are actually Hamas fighters. Then people pointed out that there was actually a known journalist in the pics. Here's this tweet. This translates. This was in Arabic. The occupation arrests Al-Arabi Al-Jadid correspondent Dia Al-Khalat in northern Gaza Strip. So saying he's one of the journalists who's been arrested. Here he is. You can actually see him amongst the civilians. They've got him circled there. Among the civilian detainees photographed by the occupation army, his fellow journalist. He's the bureau chief of that particular newspaper in Gaza who appears in this photo. There he is. A person who knew him said, I begged him to leave, move to the south, but he replied he could not leave his disabled daughter and old mother. Rami Abdu, Euro-Mediterranean human rights monitor, speaking about his friend, Dia Khalat, who's kidnapped by the Israeli army in Gaza along with many other civilians. So this is, and here's another picture of him. So you're going to kind of get, that is the journalist who is pictured in there, and he has a disabled daughter and older mother. Now, what people are saying is that the men in the north, anyone who's been left in the north, they've rounded up the men. These are the reports we're getting, that they've rounded up the men, and this is what they're doing to the men. And then the women and children, are trying to move south. I don't know how they're moving them south, if they're making them walk, would be my guess, or they're transporting them if they are disabled, but they're clearing out the north. Now, I don't know the last time I've ever heard of a war zone being cleared out of every single civilian, every single last civilian being cleared out of a war zone. People live in war zones. My mother grew up in a war zone. Aleppo was a war zone. The civilians are still there. Afghanistan, people are still living there. I mean, Mariupol in Ukraine, people are still living there. Civilians still live in these war zones. Now, many of them get killed. They're not supposed to. Militaries are supposed to take great precautions to ensure that they don't actually kill civilians. That is not what's going on. But it's very odd for a military to go and actually clear out every single last remaining civilian from an area. That is not normal. So the only reason why you do that is if you're trying to clear the area, not because you're actually wanting to do it for their safety. Oh, it's not safe here. You got to go. No, that's not why you're doing it. It's not because, well, there's combatants and you might get bombed. You might be caught in crossfire. That's the normal. People flee on their own. We've seen many refugees flee war. People will leave on their own because they don't want to get bombed. They don't want to be caught in the crossfire. They don't want to risk it. So they take their families and they leave. But that's their choice. Maybe there's some countries or humanitarian organizations that try to help them leave. But it's ultimately still their choice. They can still stay. We're seeing something totally different go on here in northern Gaza, where Israel's actually clearing them out, every single last one of them. And that's the report that we're getting. So here's some more confirmations that these men are civilians and not Hamas fighters. This is Motaz. He is he's heavily followed journalist in Gaza. Israeli army arrested Palestinian civilians from a school in Beit Lahaya in the north of Gaza Strip and forced them to take off their clothes and left them in the cold street before detaining them. They were all civilians. So this journalist is saying these were civilians. He lives in Gaza. He's there in Gaza. He's been following everything that's going on. And the evidence looks like they're civilians. They're wearing flip-flops and there's no weapons. And then here's Times of Israel pretty much seemingly confirming that these are civilians, saying IDF says troops probing those left in Jabalia and Shajaya for ties to Hamas. So these are civilians. They've now confirmed it, but they're probing them to see if they're Hamas. So that's what they're doing. Now we know these are civilians. They're being probed. The IDF is thinking maybe they're going to get some Hamas fighters out of them. Maybe some of them are Hamas, and they'll be able to have a win. But this is the problem, right? They start off with these images. Oh, look, we got all these Hamas fighters. And then people say, well, those don't really look like fighters, and they're wearing flip-flops. And wait a minute, that's somebody we know. That's not a Hamas fighter. And then they kind of bow, okay, well, we're actually, we're interrogating them. We've arrested them, and we're interrogating them to see if they're Hamas. Really what they're doing, they're clearing the north. They're getting rid of anybody and everybody left in the north. There's tens of thousands of people left, and they are clearing them. And this is the way they're doing it. There have been some other really terrible reports that have come out making a lot of claims, but I don't want to talk about those claims about what the IDF may or may not be doing to certain people until that's verified. But there have been some other claims that have been really terrible, but we have to wait and see. Unfortunately, we need to continue to gather some evidence, but it's been really bad. What we have seen so far, it's all pretty bad. But again, how do you explain that they're clearing out every single last civilian from the north and they're moving them to the south, and now they're bombing the south? You'd think that they'd tell people, well, go back to the north because now we're coming after the south. So why don't you guys get back up that way? Go back to your homes if they're still standing. But this is just devastating imagery coming out of rounding people up, detaining them. I mean, this is going to go down as this is very shameful, very shameful.